I'll start again. Peter, I hope that wasn't a metaphor, the caged animals, for all of us being together in the same hotel for 3 days. I am Ken Wollack. I'm chairman of the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. And before my retirement from a day job, I was president of the National Democratic Institute for nearly 3 decades, where we were fortunate to benefit from Peter's talent in some challenging environments overseas. And NDI's loss was Halifax's gain. This conference rightfully describes itself as the leading security meeting for democracies. It is therefore fitting that our concluding plenary session is dedicated to this linkage. By the way of introduction, I'll just say that efforts to advance democracy has, in recent years and in certain circles, become an issue of some debate. Paradoxically, it is seen as too bellicose, conflated with regime change and military force, or too soft or idealistic as a response to serious security threats. The real issue, however, is not whether democracy promotion is hard or soft, or fits neatly into the realism or idealism paradigm. The issue is whether advancing democracy is a means of advancing our collective interests and protecting our security. And I think the answer is yes. We have learned a few things about the relationship between democracy and security. First, regimes that brutalize their own citizens are more likely to act aggressively against their neighbors. This is certainly and tragically borne out by one-man rule in Russia and China. Second, that hotspots more likely to erupt in violence are found, for the most part, in areas of the world that are non-democratic, places where our Pentagon has defined as the arc of instability. These are places that experience ethnic conflict and civil war. They generate refugee flows across borders. I believe it was Secretary of Defense James Mattis who once said that people do not flee a free press. They harbor terrorists and they produce illegal drugs. And we know in this interconnected and interdependent world, what happens for good or for bad within borders of nations has regional and sometimes global impact. Contrary to that famous tagline in tourism marketing, what happens, let's say, in Kiev or Cairo or Wuhan or Damascus, in San Salvador or Tigray, doesn't stay there. If our ultimate foreign policy goal is a world that is secure, stable, humane, and safe, and where the risk of war is minimal, then our collective efforts to advance greater freedoms globally represent a convergence of our values and our interests. To address these and other issues, we are privileged to have 4 panelists from 4 regions of the world with very diverse experiences. They have lived through the rise and fall of democratic rule and have witnessed civil war, foreign aggression, violent extremism, humanitarian crises, and military coups. Collectively, they have been scientists, diplomats, legislators, heads of government, political party leaders, civic activists, journalists, and cabinet ministers. Luis Almagro, to my right, is a Uruguayan lawyer, diplomat, and politician who served as foreign minister from 2010 to 2015. He also served in diplomatic posts in Beijing and Tehran. And he currently serves as the 10th Secretary General of the Organization of American States. Hanna Hopko is a civic leader in Ukraine who has served as the chair of the Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. She was one of the group of young politicians who went from protest to politics following the 2014 Revolution of Dignity. Hanna is today traveling the world on behalf of her country's fight for its sovereignty and freedoms. Tawakkol Karman became known as the Lady of the Arab Spring in recognition of her role in the 2011 pro-democracy youth uprising in Yemen, for which she won the Nobel Peace Prize that same year. A journalist by training, she continues to give voice against corruption and authoritarianism, not only in Yemen, but around the world. Lassina Zerbo, the former Prime Minister of Burkina Faso, who was deposed following the first of 2 military coups this year. I happened to be in Ouagadougou in 2015, following what was then a successful transition, and it has been a tragic situation this past 12 months. He is a world-renowned geophysicist who has championed arms control and nuclear non-proliferation. His efforts have been recognized by countries from Chile, the Dominican Republic, and Kazakhstan to the US, Japan, and Madagascar. I wanted to begin by asking each of you a question specific to your country and region. And given your international experiences, asking each of you to address more general questions regarding democratic challenges and opportunities after 15 years of what has been described as a global democratic recession. These broader issues, I think, are important because the threats to democracy, whether they relate to corruption, disinformation, political polarization, growing cooperation among autocracies, and independent media, all require a collective response by the international community. Hannah, I'll turn to you first.
Ladies first, as usual.
This conference has spent a good deal of time talking about Ukraine, as it should, and talking a great deal about the security of Ukraine, as it should. But as a former politician, I'd like to ask you a political question. The N-word, negotiations, has been on people's minds over the last several weeks. We heard President Zelensky outline his 10-point peace plan. But let me raise a hypothetical question to you. In a week or a month, President Putin says, I'm willing to sue for peace, to negotiate, with no preconditions. And my question is about Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian politics. If there is a push for premature negotiations, what impact would that have on the Zelensky government and democracy more broadly in Ukraine?
Thank you for this, I think, very important question, but 95% of the population believe that Ukraine is winning and Ukraine will defeat Russia. 95%. Around 89, almost 90% thinks now, after all these massive cruise missiles, ballistic rockets, kamikaze drone attacks on our critical infrastructure, which are happening these days in Kiev, in Kharkiv, in Lviv, almost everywhere in Ukraine. It's like 9/11 is happening every day in Ukraine. So even after this, people think that we have to maintain resistance and continue our fight. So I think President Zelensky, he depends on people decision and what people think that the nation should do. We have to keep fighting until the complete victory comes. I just came from Taiwan and South Korea, and it reminded me also about last century when Ukrainian dissidents were also traveling to Taipei and Seoul. It was 1957, as I remember, when the Asian League of Anti-Communism, Asian Anti-Communism League of People was established. So I think it's really important to pass this message of geopolitical actuality of Ukraine defeating Russia. And it's not just about Ukraine, because everyone is focusing on Ukraine's security. I think we have to think globally. And during the World Movement for Democracy, where different people from 70 countries, from Africa, Latin America, were there, everyone was talking about how to defeat Russian colonialism, Russian imperialism, and why victory of Ukraine is so important. So, and answering on all these peace talks, you know that Ukrainian Council of National Security of Defense, they adopted a decision which, according to this decision, no negotiations with Putin. And this was also public position of our president. So, but what I could say, I remember 2014, 2015, when I entered to the parliament and became the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I truly believe at that time that all negotiations will result at least in the ceasefire, long-lasting ceasefire. 8 years of peaceful settlement of Russian aggression, when we were like encouraged that only political diplomatic way is the way to go. Ukrainians, please, do not ask weapons. No javelins for you. We received javelins only in 2016. It was too late. And after 8 years of Minsk Trilateral Contact Group, Normandy format, and many others, we ended up with genocide. So we are facing now, let's be very frank and clear, Russia is committing genocide in Ukraine. And the same what happened in last century in Holodomor, a man-made famine organized by Stalin, when Ukrainians, just because we are Ukrainians, the breadbasket of Europe, we were dying because of hunger, a famine. And at that time, on November 16, the US established diplomatic relations with Soviet Union. And after Holodomor genocide, Holocaust happened. So I think it's really important to learn the lessons from history. And it's not just history within, you mentioned 15 years of democracy. I would say even from the Soviet Union disintegration, because it's really important, and even wider, because Peter the Great, when he renamed Muscovy in 1721, still in the name of Rus. Could you please raise hands who visited Kiev in this room, audience? So almost everyone. You see the beauty of St. Sophia Cathedral, one of the most ancient. St. Sophia Cathedral was built at the beginning of 11th century when Moscow didn't exist. So this is why our answer to all negotiations. It's about defeating Russian imperialism, that they never become a threat, not just for Ukraine, for Belarus, for Moldova, for Georgia, Venezuela, Syria, and not supporting China in potential attack on Taiwan and others. And also for me, it's about justice. Justice because all generations, millions of people who were suffering during Peter the Great times, Soviet Union, from Lenin to Stalin and others, millions of Ukrainians who died. They are asking from heaven, we have to win. So this is moral duty for us and my generation. And also as the mother of 12-year-old daughter Sophia for last 9 years, actually I'm sacrificing my maternity because I have to bring victory to my country. But I have no doubt that my daughter's husband and her kids in the future will never fight with Russians, because such threat as Russia or Moscovia or Soviet Union will never exist and will never face it.
So I assume, Hannah, you would agree with James Traub, who wrote in Foreign Affairs just several weeks ago, that in this case, it's time to give war a chance.
It's time to receive more F-16 ATACMS, and actually democracy without weapons is blah, blah, blah. We received before. So actually, I hope we are here not just to make statements. Our armed forces, they're really the brightest and the most powerful forces. Ukrainian armed forces is de facto European armed forces. And it will be, and it is the best contribution to the, not just to protection of eastern flank of NATO. If you want to protect Poland, help us to defeat Russia.
Okay. Thank you, Anna. Mr. Secretary General, one of the more positive developments over the past 4 decades in defending democracy on a regional and global level has been the emergence of a democratic architecture or ecosystem that includes governments, aid agencies, intergovernmental organizations, and networks of parliaments, political parties, and civil society activists. The Organization of American States seemed to move away from the principle of non-intervention among member states to a more activist role in places where democratic order was interrupted. Peru was a case in point in 2000. And the OAS Democratic Charter became a model for other regional groups, such as the African Union. But autocratic member states are now becoming more aggressive and smarter in subverting your personal efforts at the OAS. And Russia and China, it would seem, are trying to buy influence. How serious are these internal and external threats to intergovernmental groups like yours? And what outside assistance is needed for a pushback? And what internal reforms could be made to protect your democratic mission?
Yeah, this is for a book. First of all, of course, we have a very dynamic role, and it's mainly related to stabilize the democratic governance in the region. We have serious challenges related to that. We have applied Article 17 of the Inter-American Democratic Charter 8 times during this period. Right now, our mission is going back to Peru, arriving to Peru today, in order to bring stability and political dialogue into the political system. So we have permanently challenges we have had, of course, among these applying of Article 17. It was in Haiti, it has been in Peru twice, it has been in Guatemala and El Salvador. Plus, at the same time, of course, we have to support electoral transitions that sometimes become very difficult. And of course, we have been successful with that. Free political prisoners, and we have been successful with that. We freed, in beginning 2020, 320 political prisoners in Nicaragua. What I mean is that we act more like a moral force. We are an extreme poverty organization. We have the budget of a community college. Nevertheless, we play above our weight, and of course, we have to face permanently new dynamics and new challenges. We have 3 dictatorships now in the region, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. How this dictatorship permeates the rest of the political system is quite a challenge. How drug trafficking permeates the rest of the political system is another challenge. Violence and structural problems like violence and corruption, of course, are big challenges also in order to preserve democracy. We cannot touch the Inter-American Democratic Charter now, and we shouldn't go into a process to reform that, because it will only deteriorate. Today, it's impossible that we will have the consensus that we had in 2001. Impossible, practically. We don't have this enthusiasm for democracy that we used to have. These authoritarian regimes in the region, of course, they are playing their game. We are facing an enemy with deep pockets, and that is playing their game and trying to influence political campaigns and trying to influence, of course, the way that the institutions work. Our main challenge is to keep the fight for freedom and peace, as I said in the video. And that challenge, of course, is something that we have to shape up for the occasion, no matter how less scarce the resources are, no matter how serious is the challenge, and no matter how powerful and mighty are the autocratic enemies. We just have to keep doing our work. Defending institutions is something that it's an imperative in the region. I always hope that these political changes will just reinforce the need for democracy. Alternation in power is a good thing and has to be understood in that way. But at the same time, of course, keeping institutions alive, keeping an independent judiciary, keeping freedom of expression and civil and political guarantees alive, keeping institutions operative and efficient. Those are the challenges that we have these days. We just keep working. We are professionals doing our job. I mean, and we have to respond to every single political crisis. I borrowed from some brands some mottos, and one of them is never hide, and the other one is don't crack under pressure, and the other one is we keep walking, and we keep walking no matter the circumstances.
Well, that's certainly the reputation that you have developed, Mr. Secretary General. And China and Russia?
You know, they are different things, completely different things. Of course, the Russian war in Ukraine is something that it bothers us a lot. And the future of democracy in the region, it will depend a lot of the outcome of that war. We are in Ukrainian hands in many ways. Democracy has to be strong. I mean, I said in the op-ed. I mean, when Athens lost to Sparta, then democracy deteriorated, and when they lost against Macedonia and Filippo, that was it. It was over after 500 years. Now we only have 300 years of democracy. So we have to shape up for the occasion. Democracy has to be strong to defend itself. And if something goes wrong in Ukraine, then the autocratic regimes of the region will feel much more entitled, and they will permeate in a harder way the rest of the political systems. And they will feel that they have a momentum in order to achieve, let's say, to push democracy back. So to keep democracy alive and strong, we depend a lot on what happens in Ukraine, because in the reverse, it will be a moment to push these autocratic regimes that it's not a moment for them in the world, it's not a moment for them in the region, and then we may achieve some substantial gains, I hope. China. I was ambassador to China for 3 years. China is the main trade partner and sometimes investor in most of the countries of the region. And that is something that is practically impossible to reverse. I mean, no matter how many trade agreements we can sign around, there is no other market like the Chinese market for Latin American and Caribbean commodities. At the same time, it was a cheap way to invest or to reinvest. So that cannot be taken away. What it has to be defended and preserved are the principles and values of democracy, not to give them away because of these trade gains or whatever. So it's something that, you know, when I was ambassador there, I asked them for four things, in fact, but one was for us. One was that not to buy land in Uruguay. I mean, they can buy the whole country with the return of the matchboxes. Not to bring workers to the country. Not to buy projects that they are already going on. So if they wanted to go to buy new ones. and of course not to take money from them. And somehow it worked for quite a while, and it was the base of a revelation that somehow it was praised a couple of 1 year ago, 2 years ago, that it worked in a very institutional way. But it's how you make China respect the asymmetries, and how you make China respect your principles and values. And that is it's mainly about you, and about how you plant yourself with those principles and values. Because I have seen that what happened in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other countries, that they were too eager to give away everything, because these principles and values, they didn't mean so much for them. So, but that is, I think, is quite a challenge, because we cannot, if at this moment you take away the whole Latin American trade export to China, it will be an economic disaster in the region. We can't afford that. And so we have to work on that, and how we stand on that. And we have to see the future. I mean, I'm not saying that we should go to a Kissingerian. I'm talking too much. No. Yeah.
We'll come back.
Okay.
Okay. Tawako, it's great to see you again.
Thank you.
You have seen your country go from a slowly emerging democracy, or more precisely, a more open political system, to virtually a failed state, whose citizens have experienced one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. Given that the conflict became a proxy war by non-democratic states in the region, what beyond negotiations are needed to reach a real settlement to help return Yemen to where it was before? And is democratic government that you fought so hard for an elusive goal anymore?
Yeah. To answer this question, I will start with agreeing with Hannah when she said that Putin should be defeated in Ukraine. This is very important for all the people who are fighting, who are dreaming for democracy. What Ukrainian people now doing is they are trying to protect the democracy around the world. They are not just defend on Ukraine. The battle in Ukraine now is like the battle between Democrats and authoritarian regime, between democracy and dictatorship. And why it happens? Why Putin dare to occupy Ukraine? Because he didn't face a real position, a real any action against him when he killed people in Syria, when he supported Bashar al-Assad and he killed and pushed millions of people to flee from Syria. So talking about negotiation, it's very important. I was in Ukraine months ago with two of Nobel Peace Prize laureates, Lima Goboy from Liberia and Judy Williams from America. And we visited a lot of Ukrainian people, and oh my God, that was all their stories, most of it, it's the same stories in Yemen, the same stories in Syria. And also their demands for freedom, the same thing that people in our countries, suffer and also call for. So negotiations should lead to a just and a comprehensive and a sustainable peace in Yemen. When you return to Yemen, Yemen did a great peaceful revolution against the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh. Under the rule of the dictator, Yemen was in the, how can I say it in English? They will announce it as a failed country. So one of the reason of Yemeni revolution was for many things. All the crisis that and it was because of this dictator in economy, in political issue, in every field. So the peaceful revolution did a great work, and the peaceful revolution put Yemen in the beginning, in the gate of democracy and peaceful transition. And we won the battle of peaceful movement, and also we wrote the draft of constitution that will guarantee democracy in Yemen. The coup happened after that. The coup happened after the great national dialogue, great national negotiation with the previous regime. And the coup happened because it's supported by the dictator Ali Abdullah Saleh, who has the immunity that gave him the platform to gather him again, to make alliance with Saudi Arabia, with Emirates again, the enemy of democracy in Yemen, and to wage the coup against Yemen. And also from other hand, with Houthi militia who make alliance with the Iran. So what Yemen is suffering now is suffering from a proxy war from Iran and Saudi Arabia. And Yemeni are, paying the price of dreaming for democracy, revolt for democracy, and sacrificing for democracy. Now we have now a temporary truce. It's a fragile temporary truce. But the question, so look, Yemeni people really want peace, and really ready for peace. And the only one who waged the wars in Yemen is the Saudi Arabia and Emirates from one hand, and Iran who supported Houthi from other hand. And there is a very important when we talk about peace, when we talk about truce, and I am in general I like the truce that make people a little bit calm, but not the truce that will prepare for a big war after that. When you talk about peace in Yemen, they are talking about just the war between Houthis and Saudi Arabia. They don't talk about the sustainable peace that will lead to really lead to stability in Yemen. For example, when you talk about peace, they have to stop the sending missiles to Saudi, and the Saudi has to stop the bombs. And is this the war in Yemen? Of course not. Saudi Arabia and Emirates are occupying Yemen, are occupying its lands, its islands, its airports, its ports. All of this under their hegemony and control. And none of this, when they talk about peace, they don't talk about Saudi should withdraw all their, affiliation in this, in this area. The same thing with Houthis. Okay, Houthis should stop should stop the peace, and it's just the masses. Okay, what about their weapons? What about their weapons? And they believe, and their racism method that want Yemeni to be under their, rule for decades as their divine rule. So it needs to know what is the peace. Listen to the people, what they want. What is the peace that really will lead to the? So Putin should not achieve any goals in Ukraine that will guarantee the democracy around the world. Because if Putin wins this battle, the battle of authoritarian, the camp of authoritarian regimes will be the leader of the future. The leader of the future. And now, when the Western governments, what they claim themselves that they are democrat, they give him the green light when they didn't defend the dreams of people in Syria. Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Prime Minister, civil society in Burkina Faso played a central role, an extraordinary role in 2014 in the demand for the restoration of democracy when the then President Compaoré try to extend his 27-year rule. In a series of coups this year, which of course you were a victim, the same civil society groups have become, from my observations, relatively quiet. Perhaps because of the inability of a democratic government and governments to deal with a serious Islamic insurgency. What does it say about linkages between security and the ability of democracy to deliver? And do you believe the Burkina Faso military will turn to Russian mercenary forces, as Mali has done, to defend its rule, suppress the civilian population, and to take on the insurgency? And finally, how effective are these Russian forces, the Wagner Group, in the long term in the West African Sahel? Will we see them 5 years from now?
Thank you, Ken. Look, last night when I received a text from a friend of mine telling me, you must be kidding to be in a panel where they talk about democracy. Your country just suffered 2 military coups. How can you talk about democracy? And then I asked myself, should I come to the panel? But I'm happy to be here, to be in this panel, and then I thank the Halifax Forum for making me sit on the future of democracy. You're right, civil society in 2014 played a big role in what we call l'insurrection in Burkina Faso. But civil society at that time was nascent. When I say nascent, they were independent. It was after a long period of government, 27 years, by President Compaoré. And then the population had evolved a lot. Today, Burkina Faso, you talk about 75% of the population below 30. That's a ticking bomb. And that's something that the government at the time should have anticipated. So they were organized. There were NGOs that were coming, talking to the younger generation, people who were coming from the Western countries or East where they've studied, and who were thirsty of seeing change in the country. And those are the people who brought the change in 2014. So why we see them quiet today? Simply because civil society has been politicized. They're not as independent as they were in 2014. Because the essence of civil society is its independence from the state. It's also its self-reliance, which is not the case today in Burkina Faso. Same as our army has been politicized. Politicized, you have different factions in the army who believe in different political system or political alliances. So that is not helping the country to survive 2014 and then to continue in the democratic regime that has started with the transition, the successful transition, and President Kabore, who has started. But you see, one understanding is that it was too easy for the democratic regime to come because it was a party that had only 2 years that won the election. So they had probably difficulty shaping themselves around this new role that they're playing after 27 years of power from President Compaoré. And then they didn't adapt themselves well to the reality of the country. And this has basically changed the way the youth perceived democracy, the way the youth perceived accountability from a government, and then the way they were still thirsty of coming and play an important role. So what happened I was called to come and contribute. I'm not a political figure. I'm a public figure, as I said. And then we suffered 2 military coups. We suffered the 2 military coups. What I want to say is that reporters that talk about exactly what happened in our countries are not always as clear in what they say. Because I was sitting home and then watching television where they were saying that I was arrested, tortured, and then I was in a military camp, and then I was basically at home. But how that can be translated to the media, that the military coup was so violent that the president, the prime minister, the speaker of the parliament were under arrest and then they were tortured, that's a different story. So now, coming to how we overcome this situation, I would simply say democracy in Burkina Faso or in any other country, especially in our part of the world when you have over 50 or 60% of illiteracy, is difficult. When people can't choose or think for themselves, act with purpose, it's difficult for them to express or live democracy. So you asked the question about Wagner. Look, I haven't experienced Wagner in Burkina Faso. I can't talk about Wagner. I heard of Wagner in Mali, but that's probably someone else to talk about. So now the perception of like what happened 2 days ago when 100 or 150 people go to a Western country embassy and then try to push them away and then raise a Russian flag, I think it's more linked to the gap that others are living, and then the experience of a neighboring country that seems to be attractive to people who really don't understand what they're doing. I don't think it's something that is physically or practically instrumentalized by a specific country, because I didn't live that. I didn't feel that. So I'll give you an example of somebody who had a flag, a Russian flag, and then the radio came to him and then said, which flag is this? He said, no, I don't know. But how did you get it? Oh, I was given the flag to just demonstrate. So when you talk to somebody who doesn't even know what flag is holding, and then when you have a situation where even a military, which is a low-level military officer holding a different country's flag, which is completely against what would be in a military system, that tells you that we need probably more education, more training for people to understand, to try to think for themselves, to act with purpose. And that will help them to make a difference between what is good for them and what is not good for them.
Thank you. Why don't we turn it now to the audience for questions? I'd like to then at the very end, hopefully to leave on an optimistic note, to ask the panelists a question at the very, very end. So we'll leave a couple minutes at the very end. Yes? And please identify yourself if you could.
My name is JJ Omojua from Nigeria. If you look at the map of the world in the year 2000, about 22 years ago, most of the countries, so if you used blue for America, you will see that it's a blue map in terms of how people traded between, whether they were trading with China mostly or the US. It was a blue map. 20 years later, when you look at that map, it's mostly red, especially outside of North America. Everywhere else is mostly red. That's China. Most people are trading with China. And we have found that democracy is not automatic. For several years, countries were incentivized to become democratic, whether through foreign aid, through some form of grants and other such things. And we have seen how this has reduced. So a situation where aid is reducing because aid is finding excuses elsewhere, finding reasons to be expressed elsewhere. Aid is reducing. America's influence is reducing. People don't think they need to do business with America because they have the option of China. In places like Sudan, where Putin is stealing gold to fund the war in Ukraine, ordinarily in the past, Sudan would check itself because it would need something from the United States. How can democracy thrive in a situation where most countries around the world, especially most poor countries around the world, don't see the need to listen or to do business with countries like the US, like Canada, like the United Kingdom? I think I will put that to you.
To me?
Mr. Yes.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I go?
Please.
Okay. I was a Democrat in Uruguay, not because I was friendly with the United States or with the United Kingdom. It was because it was my feeling and the feeling of most of the people of the country. Grew up during a dictatorship. Since I was 10 years old till I was 22 years old. And I just don't want that back in my country. And I'm coming from the radical left of my country. The group where I was coming took arms at a certain moment, fought a guerrilla. Nevertheless, they never claudicate on that trying to make the country a more democratic country. And freedom is definitely an imperative within the country. We also have the feeling that sometimes you are left alone. I mean, for 12 years we had a dictatorship. Yesterday, the Iranian lady here was calling for help, like Cubans called for help 1 year ago, like Venezuelans called for help 3, 4, 5 years ago, like Nicaraguans called for help 3, 4 years ago, and nobody came. Democracy mainly was left to be defended by them and fought by them. And it has to be, the international community has to be, let's say, better tools in order to force democratic transitions. The international community has to have better tools in order to promote democracy and human rights and to defend human rights around. For example, my organization, it's not mine, belongs to 34 member states. This organization, we face the challenges, of course, of seeing these countries, Venezuela and Nicaragua, falling into dictatorships. And we applied all the legal tools that we had in the organization in order to stop or try to stop that, but it was not enough, definitely not enough. We always need to be committed to democracy internally, to be yourself democratic no matter what, and of course enforce the people with that. But at the same time, when you are facing oppressive regimes with indiscriminate use of force, like it's happening in Iran now, it's happening in Venezuela, Cuba, or Nicaragua, it is impossible to leave the people alone facing that kind of challenge. How can you disarm people? The Venezuelans, imagine 9 million people in risk of hunger, 7 million people that have to migrate the country. How can you fix that? How can you ask them to change a regime that just uses violence in any possible way, torture people, put people in prison, kill people, 10,000 extrajudicial executions per year? And you want these people to face them alone, an authoritarian regime like that? It is practically impossible that democracy would prevail facing this kind of people. So it's how we can have better tools, because those tools of the 20th century, they are over. They don't exist anymore, and good that they are over forever. Are the new tools that are needed for the 21st century, and it has to do with your question about transformations for the international organizations. For these international organizations, the United Nations Charter doesn't have the word democracy anywhere, and most of the constituencies that don't believe in democracy, that is a fact. But there, where there are true believers in democracy, they have to be supported, and we need to have better tools in order how they can confront organized crime, a state taken by organized crime, the levels of corruption, the levels of human rights violations, of crimes against humanity. Justice is part of the challenge, but definitely we need always to ask for the help that is requested in order to defend democracy. And this help somebody has to pay the bill for that. I mean, these people usually are in the streets they cannot afford. I mean, you can afford 1 week of demonstrations, 2 weeks of demonstration. The third week you are struggling. 3 months later you are over. I mean, and that is what we need to address. I mean, if we want to support freedom fighters, if we want to support democracy, if we want to work the democratic transitions, then the engagement of the international community is extremely necessary. And, but of course, it has to be done with the new tools of the 21st century.
We have time for 2 quick questions. In the way back, the energetic person that is waving.
Thank you very much. Because I was at the very back, I had to try a little bit more.
You succeeded.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Sabrina. I'm from Afghanistan, and I had been in a plenary session last year where, right after what had happened in Afghanistan in August 15, 2021. And everybody knows that democracy have been, the very young 20-year-old democracy of Afghanistan have been buried there. And the peace negotiation efforts has failed and become an extension of war. The fate of a nation has been into the hands of a terrorist group who have ties with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So this all means dishonoring the sacrifices and the investment that the world has done for the more than 20 years in Afghanistan, and also the energy and the efforts that the Afghan nations have done towards that. Today we are all scattered around the world without no land, with no voice, with no platform, and we don't know where to start. So my question to the panel, and especially to Tawakkol from Yemen, who might know a little more from perspective of women's life in religious-dominated government countries, that how do you see the future of democracy when you look at Afghanistan as a failure of a democratic process and efforts of the world, if we do not look back, learn from mistakes, and try to correct things that have been done wrongly? Thank you.
Tawakkol.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm so glad that...
End in 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm so glad that Afghanian woman, she's asking this very important question. And I think what happened in Afghanistan, it's kind of betrayal from America against Afghanistan. I'm sorry to say that, because what happened in Afghanistan, it's kind of hand-overing the authority in Afghanistan to Taliban. After all these decades of claiming that they are in Afghanistan to protect democracy and to save people, and at the end, they give it to those, you know, to this authoritarian regime, to those who, you know, use the religion against people, against democracy, against human rights. But I believe in people. I really believe in people. I am so sad, I am so angry how America did in Afghanistan when they started their war, and they didn't, after 20 years, they didn't make any basement for democracy. They didn't guarantee no security and no democracy. And they left Afghan people alone. But at the same time, I am really know that the Afghan people, one day, they will make change again. And as now the Iranian people, the great Iranian people, women and men, are making a great peaceful revolution against the mullahs, the authoritarian regimes in Iran, and they going to against their imama. So all the change will create by people who are really want the victory for freedom and democracy, and who will never lose this battle. So with optimism, we the people, in Yemen, in Syria, in Egypt, do you know what happened in Egypt? That there was a Western conspiracy against them. And who support the army coup in Egypt? Let me to speak with you in frank way. You are talking that you said that you want democracy, you want to protect democracy, you want to, okay, the coups in Egypt, who support them? So the only way, the biggest challenge that face the Democrat people, the Democrat fighters, is the conspiracy from Western governments who claimed that they support democracy. When they support the military coup, when they support the militia, and why I'm talking about Western governments? Of course, Russia and China, they are the head of conspiracy, and at the head of, they are against democracy. But now the question, if you want the democracy to prevail, please really support the democracy around the world. Don't make conspiracy against them. And that will also save the democracy in your countries. What is happening now with the rise of far rights is the result of not the people, not the NGOs, no, the policy of governments against democracy in the world. So I am optimistic about the future. The future will be bright. I am so proud of the result of the midterm election in the United States that's made by the young people, not by the eldest who create all this chaos, not by the racist people, by the youngest people who will lead the future of the world, in America, in Canada, in everywhere.
Thank you, Tuako. I'm going to take the prerogative of the chair to ask just a final question. Very, very quickly, I know we're a couple minutes over already. Madeleine Albright, who was my chair for 20 years at NDI, and I know, like many of you, there isn't a day that passes that I don't miss her presence and her voice. She called herself an optimist who worried a lot. And a year ago, she wrote an important article called The Coming Democratic Revival, in which she argued that despite the drumbeat of bad news, democracy could be poised for a comeback. And she cited 4 reasons. 1, it is easier to move upward from a valley than a peak. Many of today's troubled democracies were under authoritarian rule 30 years ago, meaning that Democrats are on a higher plateau from which to mount a revival. 2, the rise of authoritarianism over the past 2 decades has taken place against the backdrop of international terrorism, the 2008 global financial meltdown, the Syrian war, a global refugee crisis, and a health pandemic. These events stoke popular fears, frustrations, panic, and anger, with blame often directed at elected leaders. The next 20 years can hardly be less conducive to democratic growth. And finally, China and Russia have squandered the best opportunity they ever had to offer a convincing alternative to liberal democracy. They are failing. This was her view. And finally, the same forces that have fueled the rise of demagogues, including the human desire for change, could undermine the staying power of authoritarian regimes now old enough to embody the status quo. Do you agree with Madeleine's optimism here? 30 seconds for each one of you. Mr. Prime Minister.
I tend to agree with what Madeleine Albright said, because when you reach the bottom, there's no other way than rising up. And that's why there is optimism in a country like Burkina Faso. There is a triple challenge in Burkina Faso and in the Sahel. Security with the terrorism. I think the Afghan lady mentioned how they end up with terrorism. We need to fight and win the fight against terrorists in the Sahel. The same way the outcome of the Ukraine war will be the future of democracy, the same way the outcome of the war against terrorists in the Sahel will lead the future of democracy in that region. The second is development. And then the third, human rights. If you don't have those two, you can't talk about human rights. You can't come in a camp where you see internally displaced people with young kids, not knowing what they do, not even knowing where are their parents because they've been running around. And then their future, there's no future for them. When there's no future for youth, there's no democracy. And that's what happened in 2014. And that's what we would have hoped if they had the level of education to face military coup and then to come out and then speak for themselves, act with purpose. We wouldn't have coup again. We need to win our fights against this habit in West Africa to have military coup and then be endorsed by the institutional framework that we have. And that's something that we should stop. And that will lead us to a democratic government, hopefully in Burkina Faso, in Mali, and elsewhere.
Thank you. Tuako, 30 seconds.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with her, but also, as I said, that I really believe in people, that people in Yemen will prevail this battle for freedom and democracy in all Arab countries, in Afghanistan, in Iran, and in everywhere people fight for democracy and freedom. But talking about terrorism, it's very important. If you want to fight terrorism, you should fight tyranny. The dictatorship lead to terrorism, result to terrorism. Every dictator is a terrorist, and every terrorist is a dictator. They feed each other, they support each other, and they gain the results and their goals with each other. So it's very important for the international community, especially with Western governments, that we hope that they will return to defend on their values, not their interests, to stop their alliance with the dictators. If they want to stop terrorism, they have to stop their alliance with dictators, because dictatorship result all the kind of terrorists.
Hannah?
We met several times with Madeleine Albright, and she mentioned that there will be 4 countries where the destiny of the world will be decided, and Ukraine is one of the countries. So I agree.
Nigeria, Colombia, and Indonesia.
Yeah, so I agree with Madeleine Albright. I would like to say that after more than 70 years of being in Soviet prison, Ukraine renewed independence, and now we are security guarantor for the democracy globally. So this is optimism. So actually, after Ukraine defeating Russia, I'm even more optimistic. Because if today we discuss that next year Halifax Forum could meet in Yalta, I think we could meet not even in Yalta. We could meet somewhere in Bashkortostan, Tatarstan, Yakutia, meet Rzya people, Udmurtia, and others. So this is the dream, because it's about human rights, it's about dignity, it's about defending the rights of these indigenous people. And I'm thankful to Halifax for the first Hala dinner when we have this voice of indigenous people. And I'm honored to meet a representative of Uyghurs here. So actually, summarizing, don't be afraid. This is the quote of President Biden in Warsaw, the quote of St. Paul, but don't be afraid actually to recognize your mistake. I saw some American faces when my friend were mentioning the failure that the US betrayed in Afghanistan. So actually, sometimes it's really important to be brave, to recognize, because the success would have been happen if the West prevent the genocide in Ukraine. Yeah. And not now building the coalitions, thinking how to delay with weapons because of lack of strategy on Russia, on China. Ukraine defeating Russia is weakening China. So this is, I'm kindly asking, don't be afraid to recognize your failures and actually that your deterrence strategy of Russia also failed. And actually, I want to add optimism. Also, don't be afraid to dream bigger, to have big dreams. My dream is one day to visit Red Square in Moscow, and we will be opening 2 memorials on the genocide, Holodomor from last century made by Stalin, and second genocide made by current totalitarian regime. So this is only by not just reparations matter, international tribunal, but also Russian Sikh society is a problem. Because Russian Sikh society allowed Putin grow into the totalitarian regime. So Russia, through repentance and establishing these monuments, this is how they will recognize that millions of people were killed in last century and now. So this is the way to go.
Louise, Peter is ready to storm the stage, so just very short.
Yeah, very short. I agree with Madeleine Albright. I am optimist and I worried a lot. I think we have a fair chance. I mean, vulnerabilities here expressed and some others can be fought and can be fought back, and definitely victory can be on the side of democracy in a very easy way. Just to engage in the issue is the matter, and it's about that. And so we have a fair chance about that. And of course, if you have to face tyranny, I mean, and I always like the phrase of Churchill, no? Face the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. But it's better that when the superpower comes into action and fix a couple of the issues.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your courage. Peter?
Ken, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. I'm not going to sum up. I just have about 30, 45 minutes of remark.
Keep them brief.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I am going to sum up. Number one, Ukraine is saving democracy. All Ukrainians are heroes. Number two, if you love freedom, you will continue to support Ukraine's fight for freedom because it's a fight for all of us. Everything becomes easier when Putin fails in Ukraine. And number three, when democracies walk together, they can do anything. And so I just want to echo Hannah, echoing the President of the United States of America, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Everybody here in this room knows that. Go home, tell your legislators, tell your governments, don't be afraid. Democracy is the future because the alternative is not an alternative. So that's it. That's what's at stake. You all know that. Make it happen. Safe trip home.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the Halifax International Security Forum. Thank you for joining the conversation.